Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm happy to see Molly, especially after a long time. So I'm just going to, as Corinne has put it in the introduction, I will just go through some of the work that I've done, which really has some inclination to narrative, both as a methodological approach in data collection, but also as a way through which data can be analyzed. So that would be the outline of what I'll be discussing in this session. I'll just give a very brief background, and I'll talk about the nature of narrative in health research, because much of my work for my PhD and just after my PhD really relates to this sociology of medicine and also issues around chronic conditions. Even the work that I did around COVID could be classified within this social aspect of health research. Then I'll move on to look at the usefulness of narrative. Why is narrative so useful for people that are researching health-related topics? And why was it useful for the work that I was involved? I'll discuss how narrative was used. Then I'll move on to look at what exactly do you have to look out for, especially if you're dealing with inequalities within the context of health research. I'll give you 3 examples. Then I'll require or ask that we do some exercise, and then we'll be done. All right, so just as a way of intro, please feel free to interrupt me. I want this to be more of a discussion as opposed to a lecture. I think a lecture is one-sided. I'll appreciate if you think there's something that you would want to me to clarify on. Please just feel free and raise your hand through the Zoom feature that we have. Okay, so for I think several years now, particularly in Zambia and also just Africa as a whole, the idea of HIV has really been seen or discussed in the context of resource constraints and poverty. People have written, they've done research, they have done studies around the link between HIV and poverty. And we see that a lot of these discussions on HIV have been dominated by this idea of resource constraint, which can be linked to the inequality discussion that I want to focus on today. Like any other form of pandemic, HIV, we have seen it with COVID. COVID has sort of opened up discussions around inequalities that exist between countries, between social groupings. So pandemics are not susceptible to forms of inequalities, if you were to put it that way. And I'm using the word forms of inequality because, as we'll see later on in my discussion, there are very different stratas or layers of inequalities within the work that I have been involved in. And these layers, sometimes they emanate from the different sections of how people are grouped and how people are classified, social strata. And for those that are not given the visibility, then we start a different conversation around marginalization of some sections or particular populations of a given society. So whatever I'm discussing here draws from the work that was conducted I think mid of 2019. And it connects to all these issues of health, psychosocial support, and material resources. So what then is the nature of narrative health research? I'm using the word health very loosely here to signify, the focus of a form of, investigation, exploration around the welfare, the well-being of people, and the context in which the term health is being used here has to do with, not just the physiological part of one's health, but also the mental, as well as the interpersonal kind of relationships that people share, especially those that have that are living with chronic conditions such as HIV, which some scholars argue that it can't be considered a chronic condition, and others put it or classify it as a chronic condition. But I'm using that word in a very loose sense. So the nature of narrative in a study or in research that involves health or the medicalization of bodies is much more, at least from where I'm standing, about challenging the way in which particular groups, particular key populations are represented in academia, in the world of non-governmental organizations, in the media. So it brings in the idea of power relations that narrative research for health-related kind of work has to do with bringing in the question of power in the discussion. But more importantly, like I mentioned, is to make those voices, again, I'm using the word voice very consciously here, is to make those voices which have been silenced for a long time to have a platform to talk or discuss the experiences. So the focus really is to look at the expressions, the representations, the experiences, the telling of the participants, and in this case, we are calling them the narrator, his own terms or expressions. Again, I must say that the approach that I use or that I keep using in some of the research work that is ongoing draws much from, I think I have to share that, I don't know that Corinne shared it, Florita's work, the 2019 book chapter. I think it sort of speaks to some of these things that in terms of the analytical approach, the data collection method that I'll be discussing today. So Florita's work would be very useful for those of you that would want to read more. I think she did some work on researching sex work that's doing the colonial intersectional narrative analysis. So besides giving an opportunity to the narrator or the people that are at the center of your work, I think there's an issue of identity construction that comes into our focus here, that the nature of narrative research in health sciences, that's sociology of medicine, as others call it, is much more linked to how people position themselves and how identities are formed to some extent. Now, how useful then is narrative? And I think that's a big question. For the kind of research that I did, narrative was very useful because sort of opened up so many avenues through which the lives of these individuals, their experiences could be not only understood, but appropriated in a way. But then the appropriation of these experiences and lives or lived realities are not from the point of view of me as a researcher, but their own appropriation. How do they represent themselves in the telling, in the stories themselves that they were given? The other thing that brings narrative as a very strong and powerful form of data collection and data analysis in health research has to do with the shaping of this issue of power, language, identity. So it allows one to sort of express themselves with the language issue at the center, the power issue at the center, as well as the identity aspect that I earlier talked about or mentioned. To some level, it's the social part, the political part, that within these stories of power, language construction, identity, there's an opportunity for the participants to sort of position themselves from within a social and political context of their stories. I'll talk a little bit more about this when I get to how I went about to analyze the responses and the stories from the participants. For this particular topic that I want to share with you, I think the focus really was to see how these inequalities are produced or how these inequalities manifest themselves within or outside a social, structural kind of arrangement. And again, there are layers and different levels of how these inequalities are experienced or manifest themselves across the board. It can be by gender, age, location. So it's very important that we also put some context to some of these inequalities. How did I go around the issue of doing this, using or applying this narrative approach? First of all, I think if you're dealing with issues around health, at least from where I come from in my country, and I think many parts of Africa, health issues, especially HIV, are seen as very sensitive to some level. So there was a lot of ethical considerations in terms of how are you going to do the selection of participants, who are you going to involve in your discussion or in your research. So I paid attention to some of the ethical issues that would bring into question the type of participants that I decided to recruit for this study. And the most important part is about the feeling that these participants get to experience after the discussion. I had moments where you are asking or you're trying to probe further, wanting these participants to explain a little bit more on some of the things that they have experienced, and someone will just break down and start crying, and it's in that moment then where you see the extent to which you can continue the dialogue or allow them to lead or feel comfortable, and not, because I think the most unethical thing to do is to leave a participant feeling disempowered, drained at the end of your session. So my thinking is that this is an important part of any type of research, ethical consideration. So in narrative research, I think more importantly is to put the participants as the center of the dialogue. You are probably just, you are an outsider in the conversation, but also there's a role that you play as a researcher within that conversation. The data collection itself was actually more on what the participants were interested in, telling, and so it's in the issues of interest, not for me as a researcher, but the issues of interest to the participants that sort of provided, a level of empowerment. So again, within the discussions, it was allowing the participants to navigate through their stories with what they thought would be appropriate, or rather empowering for them to share. So the study involved people that were living with HIV, that's both men and women. There are also a bit of some mapping and visual materials, because sometimes it's not just what we hear, it also has to do with what we see in terms of narratives. This study embraced some level of visual representation or pictorial data, which I'll discuss a little bit more and maybe give an example of some of the materials that came from the participants. The level of analysis, or the approach that was used in terms of going about the information, was much more of following a thematic narrative analysis. And I think Richmond's work has sort of provided some very interesting points around how you can use thematic narrative analysis approach, which was largely what was used or utilized for my work. So here, the focus is mainly on the content of those stories, the content of specific narratives within the discussions or the dialogue that you have with your participants. And if you follow a thematic narrative approach, what that means is that there'll be a bit of some sieving that you have to do. You have to sort of sieve through some of the issues that you are going to be analyzing or bringing forth. But there's a danger to that. There's a weakness to this form of approach, that it might leave out some of the very important, what participants would consider as important tellings. So, of course, some of the content material, some of the specifics of what the participants narrate, or the stories that they tell, are very important in leading to this idea of providing their own subjectivities and a sense of agency, which in the end is what defines the final analysis of your work, because it's not about what you think as a researcher, but it's more about what the narrator has told you. So the process of, again, doing narrative research or following a narrative approach in this kind of work that I did had to do with getting meanings from these stories, and these meanings have to be those of the participants themselves. Issues around creation of these social identities. Is there any sense of group belonging? Are there? And we'll see in one of the tasks that I gave, some of these points are coming out. Social identity, a sense of belonging, and to some level, a call to collective action. And this is something that I found to be very interesting in the work, because there was also some solidarity in the expressions or in the stories that I got from these individuals who are living with HIV. The linkages that you make from these different, what I would call life worlds, and the power relations, sort of feed into coming up with the inequalities, or pinpointing or getting to know exactly what would be considered as an inequality here. I have an example that I'll give, where in a very simplistic way, if you look at it from a layman's point of view, you don't think this is a form of inequality in any way. But if you look at the power relations that are induced as a result of certain expressions or certain visual representations, then you can make linkages between the lived experiences of these participants, and also issues of power balancing. And this power balancing is not just between you as a researcher, but also the environment in which they find themselves. Others will talk about at the clinic, at the health facility. The health personnel are not very nice to us. You have to go to a specific window for you to collect your medication. And sometimes this window is known for people that are living with HIV, and that is, it induces a level of stigma, internalized stigma, as well as anticipated stigma. So there are all these power relations that are at play in this kind of, work or lived experiences of people that have living with chronic health conditions. More importantly, is the way in which the focus was on what I would consider as common narratives. I did talk about the solidarity issue. So when I looked at all the transcripts, looked at all the stories, listened to the audios, looked at the visual materials, I think one thing that came out very clearly, there were some issues that would be considered as common narratives across all the data set. So like, I earlier mentioned, since this was a thematic narrative analysis, in a way, it was just very important for the analytical process to involve a form of coding to really focus on what inequalities are coming out from these participants' experiences. So in that sense, you find yourself having more of a template through which you have to identify how these inequalities are told by the participants. So it's about what the teller holds, what the participant holds. So in looking out for these inequalities within the narratives or the dialogue with the participants, it was more of what is it that is coming out from the teller's point of view, looking at issues of what form of identities are being constructed in this kind of narration, and more importantly, looking out for particular attention to specifics of what participants want you as a researcher. And again, like I said, narratives, at least based on my experiences, was not just about the words. It had to do with the non-verbal cues that these participants were showing me. And I don't know, in this COVID era, of course, I did make follow-ups with interviews through the phone. But for those interviews that were conducted face-to-face or in person, you could see, like the earlier example I gave of a lady breaking down because the question sort of brought memories of her past, and how you can express emotions within what your tellers hold, or within the identities that your participants are constructing, is something that maybe we can discuss or share ideas later on during the open discussion. So to some level, it's more of the structure, the systems, the social structuring and the context through which a specific narrative. So again, as well as the intrapersonal experiences, and that is why I said there were common narrations there were commonalities between what was said across the different transcripts or transcribed materials of these participants. The challenge with the work that I did was that, you know, there was a very high level of temptation to sort of divert from addressing the research question that was supposed to be, you know, be the focus of everything that was being picked from these stories. So I think this is more of a reminder that in all this, allowing the tellers or the participants to tell you what is of interest to them, I think we should never forget to address our research question. Yeah. So as a continuation on what to look out for, especially when you're dealing with narratives within the context of inequalities, it was the issue of selecting, and this was, I must say, this was a challenge. What do you leave out? What do you select? You know, and it was at this point where you really have to familiarize yourself, and the other issue had to do with issues of language barrier. You know, there are certain expressions which could not be, you know, told or could not be expressed in English by some of the participants. So they would use a local language term. So it's the process of how do you interpret this word to sort of bring out the actual meaning or the exact thing that the participant wanted you to pay attention to during the interviews. You have to know which audience are you writing the narrative for, you know, and this will help you with identifying some of the key issues that you can bring into light. The issue of how we as researchers, how our own biases, our own beliefs, how our own identities, the politics, the history, how all these issues, you know, can play out within a research, I think need to be given some attention. So again, remember what I said, one way of dealing with something like this, of how you can step out as an outsider and look at these narratives from outside, is to allow the interests of what was being taught, especially if participants were very categorical, to be given some level of space, and if anything, the selection process of whatever appears to be, not only appears, but whatever speaks to the issues that seem to be coming out across the common experiences of your participants. So if for example, I find myself beginning to place my beliefs, my experiences into the conversation, especially during analysis, I think the best thing that one can do is to look at whether whatever you're trying to communicate to the particular audience in your writing or in your analysis, when you're looking out, for example, for an inequality or inequalities, is something that you can find in almost all the scripts, or at least, you know, the majority of your transcripts. And when I say scripts, I'm talking about the transcribed material. So from the audios, you type them, and then you start looking through. And, you know, for those that are okay with just listening in and writing based on what you've picked from the stories in audio format, that's your stance. But yeah, the point I'm trying to make here is that our own identity, our political stance, our historical experience, our historical or our history of experiences can also have a bearing on the type of research or outcome that we have. the beneficiaries themselves. I think I had a lot of these call for or requests for solutions. So when you go out in the field, the first thing that people see in you is that you've brought answers to their problems, which is not correct or which is not true, because you're a researcher and you're going out there to ask them about their, or to just listen into their stories. Remember, this is about them as tellers. So there were, again, high temptations of me being put in the spotlight to sort of make commitments to some of the issues. For example, one would say, I have a young child, and my child is 7 years old, and this child is HIV positive, and I don't know how to tell the teacher. So what would you advise me to what would be the rightful procedure? So you find yourself in a very difficult spot, because now the atmosphere changes. It puts you as a researcher into the spotlight, yet remember what we said, this is about your participants, it's about their stories are not your stories. So you have to really find a very smart way of addressing some of those issues, if at all you're going to engage in work where you'll be seen as a messiah. And I think we really have to limit our commitments, if not making any of them at all. Okay. So maybe just as a way of winding up on how you can identify some of these inequalities, I think the issue of commonality here plays a very crucial role. Imagine if you have 20 participants, and in this case, I think we had over 20 participants. You look at the different experiences, and if there's a sense of overlap, I think those are the issues that really need to be paid serious, amount of time, so that you can explore and really see through what the participants were trying to communicate. Like I said, the issue of inequalities in health happens at different levels, at least for this type of work that I do. Some of the inequalities were at a very personal level. Some of the inequalities were at a very biomedical level, a household level. Others, it was more of a mental health issue, the lack of psychosocial support, and so on and so forth. So some of the inequalities that were mentioned had some sort of counter measures, which I'll show one or two in the examples that I have. So again, like I said, thematic narrative analysis. So from the stories, what came out was that medical service support for many kinds were very limited. There was no information. I talked about stigma at facilities and from the professionals themselves. So in the stories, in the responses, in these tellings, as would say them, across almost all the transcripts, there's a very dominant issue that revolved around medical support in terms of its limitation to, or rather restricted access to services, lack of information, and just not a very hostile environment within health facilities. So that was very common among the participants. NGO support, the work of NGOs came out strongly as well. And issues of family, issues of religion, the ideas around women, some of these family faith related type of expressions were very common for women participants than males. So the support around family, church, as I would call it, and lesson friends came a lot more from the women than from the men who were in this study. Issues of work, income was very common also. Again, the women were mostly affected by this low pay kind of stories. I think a lot of them really spoke about how the lack of a good job is leading to food shortages. Sometimes you have to walk distances to go and access treatment because you don't have transport money. So again, takes us back to the introduction on the the poverty of transport, housing, sanitation. So these were common things that really came out from stories, especially among the women. Okay, now let me in the interest of time, just give an example of the visual of the mapping itself of how these inequalities are represented. I don't know if everyone can see this, but it's a bit blurred. But what I wanted to share with you here is that again, it's not just enough to represent one's experiences, especially if they deal with inequalities around pictorial information. From this picture, where you're seated, from where you are, you can interpret it very differently. But we can all possibly agree that there's an issue of transport here, the issue of distance here. So there's a small automobile there, there's a house, there's a clinic. On the other side, there's sanitation, toilet issues. So it tells us a lot about the life of this particular participant, that their life revolves around the clinic, their house, and sanitation issues. So these might be considered as things that they really wanted someone to pay attention to. Maybe it's the distance from their home to the clinic. Maybe it has to do with having an outdoor pit latrine and not a very good piped toilet with consistent running water. So within this same picture, we can see the issue of diet and food, on the just below the clinic down there. I'm thinking maybe this participant wanted to show the issue of how important it is to have vegetables, fruits. That might look like an apple right there, so we can get a sense of something being communicated here. There's a story in this picture, and so and if you look at the type of human representation that is within this picture, you can probably tell that this was done by a female, because the picture itself is represented by an image that depicts a woman. So this is just an example. Of course, there are so many things that can be talked about on this kind of representation, but yes, even with mapping, even with using drawings, people representing themselves and their lived experiences, we could still pick some level of inequality. Now, example number 2. Karen, hope we are doing well on time. I'll be winding up soon. Example number 2. So in this picture, one would think these are flowers, and this is a decoration. But this picture tells us something different. The picture itself might inform us of, it can trigger a story of, a meaning of medication. So learning from the participant's point of view, it appears, or it came out very strongly within the period of gathering these materials, that in fact this here is selenium. Selenium is a supplement. So for people that are on ART treatment or HIV treatment, they are encouraged to boost their immune with supplements. Now, in the very remote area where I went to collect, one of the remote parts or sites of my data collection, you can hardly find a pharmacy there. So it's in the western part of Zambia, very remote. And so the only time these participants have the opportunity to go and buy or access a pharmacy is when they go into urban areas, maybe once every month. Now imagine you have to take your supplements and then you run out. The next time you're going to be traveling to the city is after a month or so. What do? So the picture, which has what might look to someone as flowers, is actually a natural plant, which is very common during rain season in Zambia. Now, this plant has some nutritional value, or has some elements or ingredients that can be found in selenium. Again, what we see here is a counter sort of measure that in the presence of these difficulties with accessing medication, participants brought evidence. Some of them sent me these pictures, and even the color. If you look at this picture can trigger a story of the color of the actual bottle, the actual if you're going to get it from a pharmacy, the color of the bottle, or the color of the color of what was used to brand these pills, looks like it's almost the same color of the plant itself, which has got a similar nutritional value or supplement. So they were telling me about, in the absence of this is what we do. And this is collective. They learn these things from peer groups. They learn these things from colleagues who are also living with the same condition. So here, like I said earlier, words alone, cannot really communicate what someone is trying to say. I had no idea that this is what they meant when they said, in the absence of actual pills, we replace that with a natural plant, which acts as a vegetable in some level. So it's about not just about what we hear. It's more about what we see. Okay, another example. This will be the last example. Then we can utilize the remaining 40 minutes or 30 minutes or so for the task. Here, remember what I said on empowering, that one of the ethical issues in narrative research is that you must leave your participants empowered. I don't think if there's any ethical committee which would, approve a study that will leave participants feeling disempowered, drained, the example that I have put there is of a male who talks about the joy that my going there had, but there's a message within this quote here. I'm happy that you came and talked to me. Okay, so it was not just an issue of going to that particular site, it was also the issue of talking. So the talking might have empowered this participant. Maybe this was the first time that someone came through and had a chat with them about their health condition. And there are many other examples within the transcripts where people have talked about, or where people talked about how they felt empowered after the, these discussions, because it was really an opportunity for them to reflect on their health condition by telling their stories. There's an issue of the clinic here. I've been going to the clinic, but they have not come to speak to me how of course, there are some expression or grammar issues there, how you have, or in the way that you have. So there's comparison. Again, the medical issue gets into play. Health facility staff do not have the time to discuss these issues with their participants, with their clients rather. It is an issue of hope within this context. You can see someone talking about, I can see light at the end of the tunnel. So there's a sense of hope, there's a sense of joy, there's a level of empowerment, but also there's some level of displeasure within this text, especially the lack of health personnel engaging or visiting, or maybe just giving an opportunity to these clients or service users to talk to someone who is a professional on the issues that might be affecting them. And sometimes, and the sense that I got, doing this work is that these participants don't really need the material, or of course they're in need of these materials, but just someone going there, sitting down, igniting a conversation, triggering a conversation, listening to those stories is enough for them. There are some issues that we can pick from these conversations. Okay, I think I'll stop there and just maybe allow for some, maybe 5 minutes review of, I don't know if people have seen the document that was shared. I would love us to just have a brief discussion. Of course, can give each other some 10 minutes. I don't know, Corinne, do you think 10 minutes is okay? 5 minutes, just to go through these 5, let me just make this big. Just to go through 5, if not 4, 5, quotes from some of the transcripts, and just identify. You can pick one, you can pick 2. What is the inequality issue that is being communicated here within any of these quotes? And those names you are seeing are not real names. Of course, those are pseudonyms, and we sort of were interested to personify some of these quotes. So we couldn't just say P1. We would rather give them some fake names. So, Corinne, is it okay if we said 5 minutes, people to go through this and then come back, and then we say whatever we think was an inequality issue that was being communicated by the participants? Please, your guidance.
It sounds good, Sanny. I'm wondering, do you want people to look at the image at the same time? or to come
Yes.
back?
So if people have this document with them, that's fine. You can go through and then just pick on one or two, and then identify what inequality issue was being addressed here. And then there's another document. Like I said, this study really involved some visual materials, and I thought that we could also engage some of these visual materials by having a word or so on what exactly was being represented or constructed by these participants. The one that I showed you, the example that I gave you, was for an individual map. So it was done by one person. The exercise or the task that the map that is for the task has to came from the group exercise. So you see the differences there, the collectiveness of how things were being represented in the map. I hope people have that document. Also, let me just try if I can.
Sanny, I put them in the chat actually. So if
perfect. Thank you, Molly.
No problem. No problem.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so
it should be opening up pretty well from the chat, I think. So thanks, Molly. Yeah.
Perfect. So this is well, I'm trying to read Zambian time. So this will be 2:55. So we can get back at let's say 3:02. What sort of inequality?
I mean, maybe give people 10 minutes, don't you think?
10 minutes is fine. Yeah, perfect. So. Okay, great.
And what size groups were you thinking, Sanny? I can do the breakouts from here.
How many are we? Maybe that would
24 people.
24. Okay. Could we say maybe 3 in each group? Would that be okay?
3 in each group. Okay, fine. So I'm going to do it.
Because it allows people to sort of engage as opposed to having many.
Okay.
So if you can say 3 in each group, that's fine. Then we can have one person in each group to just pick up 1 or 2 points. That will be feedback for when we resume back. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you so much. We're going to go into the groups for 10 minutes. I'm just about to send that now. Okay, see you soon.
Okay, so let me just close by saying that the whole idea of using narrative in trying to identify inequalities is really about keeping the balance, and this balance sometimes can come with demands for commitment, but it is about the stories that your participants are telling you. Again, empowerment, advancing the common good. What is it that came out from all these maps? Is it the issue of water and sanitation? So there's a level of advocacy that you can see from these representations. Bringing together a sort of several, multiple, situated stories from participants' point of view. Bringing this together requires that you as a researcher don't use your political bias, your values, so that what stands out is what the participants actually shared. The findings of the work, in a way, using this approach or narrative is that, like I said earlier, it's about challenging the existing representations. So issues of poverty within the HIV discourse can be brought to light using the accounts of the people that are living with the virus itself. So again, you are bringing or giving attention to some of the historical, socio-political, economic, even cultural. If we were to bring the full scripts of some of those participants that we are using as cases, you will see the cultural dimension coming up very strongly. Issues of male hegemony within homes and so on and so forth. When analyzing these materials, I think the point that we can take away is that it's about not just listening, but thinking through beyond the words. And that's why if we were to triangulate this data from the maps, from the audios, we can see that it's not just about what was said, it's also about what was given in terms of images. Themes intersect in so many ways. Of course, using narratives can help us position some of these constructions and bring about this sense of agency into how inequalities play out in different situations. Again, I think the whole overall purpose of narrative research is to give a voice to the voiceless, at least in the context of when you're dealing with vulnerable communities or populations. It's about bringing dignity to their stories and making sure that their stories are heard. All right, thank you so much. I'll hand over to Corinne now. Thank you for